There is something about growing up black in the 1970s in Australia that people who lived through it will never forget. This wasn't America. There was no Soul Train on Saturday mornings, no Motown on every corner. The experience was quieter, harder, and, in many ways, lonelier. But it was also filled with pride and community, and with moments that shaped an entire generation. For Aboriginal kids, Torres Strait Islander kids, and the children of migrants arriving from every corner of the world, the 1970s in Australia was a turning point. A time when black culture started fighting to be seen. A time when something shifted. This is what it actually felt like. There was something about the land rights movement in the early 1970s that changed what it meant to be Aboriginal in Australia. For generations, Aboriginal people had been pushed off their country, moved onto missions, told their culture was something to be ashamed of. Then, 1971 happened. The Gurindji people began their fight. The Aboriginal flag flew for the first time. And kids, young Aboriginal kids, watching the news with their families, saw something they had never seen before. Their people standing up, demanding what was theirs. It wasn't just politics. It was the first time many Aboriginal children saw pride on a national stage. The first time someone said, "This is ours," and meant it. For kids growing up on missions and in towns across the country, it was the beginning of understanding who they were and why that mattered. When Alex Haley's Roots aired in Australia in 1977, it wasn't just a television event. It was a mirror. For 8 nights, families gathered around their sets and watched the story of Kunta Kinte, the journey from Africa through slavery to survival. Aboriginal Australians watched and saw their own history reflected back. Not the same story, but the same theft, the same forced separation, the same fight to survive and hold on to who you are. Kids sat beside their parents and grandparents, asking questions that had never been asked out loud before. Where did we come from? What did they do to us? Roots didn't just spark conversations in American homes. In Australia, it cracked something open. For the first time, Aboriginal communities had a language, a shared cultural touchstone to talk about what had been done to them. It was quiet, it was heavy, and it mattered enormously. Now here's the thing. Australia in the 1970s didn't have its own black music scene the way America did. But funk and soul still found their way in. Parliament Funkadelic, Earth, Wind and Fire, Stevie Wonder. These records were playing on Australian radio. And for black kids, Aboriginal kids in the cities, Pacific Islander kids, and kids from migrant families, the music felt electric. There was something about hearing music that sounded like it belonged to people who looked like you. Kids would dance in living rooms, at community gatherings, anywhere the music was on. It wasn't the same cultural moment as it was in America, but the feeling, the pride, that was universal. Funk didn't care about borders. It just made you move. If you wanted to know what black excellence looked like in the 1970s in Australia, you looked at the football oval. Aboriginal players were dominating VFL football, and kids knew every single one of them. Players like Lionel Rose, who became Australia's first Aboriginal world boxing champion in 1968, and who carried that pride into the decade, showed what was possible. On the football field, Aboriginal talent was undeniable. Kids would watch the matches, cheering for their heroes, seeing strong, skilled, proud black men competing at the highest level. These were not just athletes. They were proof that Aboriginal Australians belonged, proof that talent and determination could cut through. For young kids watching from the stands or around the family television, these men were everything. They were role models in a country that spent most of its history pretending Aboriginal people did not exist, Every Aboriginal community had one, the spot where everyone ended up. Maybe it was someone's yard. Maybe it was the edge of the river. Maybe it was the community hall. But there was always a place where families came together to share a meal, swap stories, argue about football, and catch up on news. Kids would sit on the ground nearby, half listening, absorbing everything. The adults talked about what was happening in the country, land rights, the stolen generations, the politics that affected their lives every single day. But mixed in with all of that were the laughs, the yarns, the stories that got told again and again. For black kids growing up in the 1970s, these gathering spots were where culture lived. Not in a museum, not in a textbook, in the voices of the elders, in the warmth of being surrounded by your people. Shaft hit Australian cinemas and black kids lost their minds. Here was a man on the big screen, cool, confident, unapologetically black, standing up to the system and winning. For Aboriginal kids who had grown up watching television, where they were invisible, seeing a strong black hero command the screen was something else entirely. It didn't matter that the story was set in New York. It didn't matter that the culture was American. What mattered was the feeling. Someone who looked like you. Someone who refused to be small. Superfly followed, and the soundtrack became legendary on Australian radio. These films sparked debates in communities. Some loved the representation, others worried about the message, but nobody could deny the impact. For the first time, black kids in Australia had cinematic heroes. And that changed something. For many Aboriginal families in the 1970s, Sunday church was complicated. Missionaries had brought Christianity to Aboriginal communities generations earlier, often alongside the destruction of traditional culture. Church was, in many ways, a tool of colonisation. By the 1970s, Aboriginal communities had made church their own. Sunday services became a place of genuine connection. The singing was powerful, gospel voices rising together in a way that filled the hall and stirred something deep. Children dressed in their best sat in the pews and watched their community come together. It was not just worship, it was survival. It was saying, "Ye are still here." For Aboriginal children growing up on missions and in towns, church was where the community gathered, where stories were shared, and where, despite everything history had done, people found strength in each other. If you were a black kid in the 1970s in Australia, chances are you would have seen a copy of Ebony or Jet magazine. These American publications found their way into Aboriginal and migrant households, and they were treasured. Here, finally, were pages full of black people succeeding. Black leaders, black entertainers, black families living their lives. For Aboriginal kids, flipping through those pages meant seeing something Australian television and newspapers almost never showed them. People who looked like them thriving. It was not a perfect mirror. The stories were American. But the feeling of recognition was real. Parents would save the issues and pass them around. Kids would study the photographs, the interviews, the advertisements. In a country that offered very little reflection of black life, these magazines were a lifeline. A quiet but powerful reminder that black excellence existed, even when Australia refused to acknowledge it. Muhammad Ali was not just an American boxing legend. In Australia, he was a symbol. When Ali fought, Aboriginal communities gathered around televisions and radios, cheering him on. Here was a black man who refused to bow down, who stood up for what he believed in, even when it cost him everything. His refusal to fight in Vietnam, his conversion to Islam, his outspoken pride in who he was. For Aboriginal kids watching, Ali represented something huge. The idea that you could be unapologetically yourself. That strength was not just physical, it was moral, it was cultural, it was about knowing your worth. Ali's famous quotes echoed through Aboriginal communities. Kids repeated them, parents discussed them. In a country where Aboriginal people were still fighting basic recognition, Ali showed them that resistance and pride were not just possible, they were powerful. You didn't need much. That was the beauty of it. Aboriginal kids in the 1970s played games that had been played for generations, games that required nothing but each other, the ground, and imagination. Chasing games. Hiding games. Games played with sticks and stones. Games that had rules only the kids understood. In the cities, kids played double dutch and hand clap games alongside kids from migrant families, Caribbean, Pacific Islander, and African. The ropes slapping the pavement, the chanting, the rhythm of it. These were not fancy games. There were no batteries, no electronics, no price tags. Just kids being kids, together, in the dirt or on the concrete. For today's generation, it might be hard to picture. But for black kids growing up in Australia in the 1970s, those games were everything. They were friendship. They were childhood. By the late 1970s, Aboriginal land councils were being established across the country. For kids, this meant something very specific. The adults were fighting back, and they were winning ground. Kids would overhear conversations at the kitchen table. Their parents and grandparents talking about meetings, about rights, about the future. It was heavy stuff for young ears. But it was also exciting. Something was changing. The country was slowly, painfully slowly, being forced to acknowledge that Aboriginal people had a claim to their own land. For black kids growing up during this time, it was not just politics happening in Canberra. It was personal. It was family. It was the slow, hard-fought beginning of being told, yes, you belong here. And that mattered more than any kid could fully understand at the time. There is something about a big family gathering in the 1970s that black kids in Australia will never forget. It did not matter if you were Aboriginal, Pacific Islander, or from a migrant family. When the extended family got together, there was food, lots of it, homemade, cooked with care and shared without question. Aboriginal families would cook damper over the fire. Pacific Islander families brought their own traditions. Migrant families added flavours nobody else in the neighbourhood had ever tasted. Kids would sit on the ground, plates piled high, listening to the adults laugh and argue and tell stories. The smell of cooking, the noise of a dozen conversations at once, the feeling of being surrounded by people who knew you, really knew you. For black kids in 1970s Australia, these gatherings were not just meals. They were the beating heart of the community. The place where culture was kept alive, not through museums or textbooks, but through food and family and being together. The 1970s in Australia were a turning point for black Australians. Not a perfect one, not an easy one, but a real one. A decade where Aboriginal people began fighting publicly for recognition, where black culture, whether it came from within Australia or arrived from America, started to find its voice. Where kids grew up knowing they belonged, even when the country around them had not yet caught up. These memories are not loud, they are not flashy. But they are real, and they shaped a generation. Which of these moments hit closest to home for you? Drop a comment below with your own memory. If this brought something back, hit that like button and subscribe. We have more stories where this came from.